The courtyard smelled of wet iron and crushed frost. When the Alpha King dragged out the scarred stallion, a murderer with hooves, he expected her to weep. He wanted submission. Instead, she tasted the copper of a bitten lip, grabbed the frayed reins, and looked at the 12-foot stone wall. The mud in the northern stronghold wasn't just dirt and water. It was a thick, freezing paste of clay, horse urine, and the ash of recent fires. It sucked at the soles of Bryn's worn leather boots, threatening to pull them off with every step she took toward the center of the yard. The cold was a physical weight pressing against her ribs, seeping through the thin, damp wool of her tunic. She shivered, but clamped her jaw shut. If her teeth chattered, the wolves would hear it. They heard everything. King Torin sat on a heavy oak chair dragged out from the great hall and planted carelessly in the muck. He didn't look like a king from the old tapestries. There was no gold on his brow, no ermine lining his cloak. He was a mountain of a man wrapped in cured pelts and dark, oiled leather, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and the underlying, heavy scent of a predator. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs, a bored, cynical slant to his mouth. Around him, the pack formed a loose, jagged circle. They were men and women who moved with too much grace, their eyes catching the weak, bruised light of the afternoon sun. "You asked for an audience, human," Torin said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the hollow space beneath Bryn's sternum. It wasn't a shout, but it commanded the air. "You stood in the freezing rain for 4 hours just to tell me my quartermaster is starving your people. I am listening." Bryn dug her fingernails into her palms. Her skin was cracked from the cold, the joints aching. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a weaver's daughter, taken as a tithe when the wolves swept through the southern valleys. She was supposed to keep her head down, scrub the cauldrons, and survive. But the grain silos were locked, and the human captives were surviving on water mixed with bone dust. "The treaty stated a winter allowance," Bryn said. Her voice felt thin, easily swallowed by the vast gray sky. She swallowed hard, forcing more air into her lungs. 4 sacks of oats and 2 salted hogs a month. We have received nothing in 3 weeks. The children are eating boiled tree bark." Torin tilted his head. A slow, mocking smile touched the corners of his lips, not quite reaching his pale, heavy-lidded eyes. "The treaty was struck with your lord. Your lord is dead. His head is currently rotting on a pike near the eastern gate. Treaties die with the men who sign them. We are still working your looms. We are still tanning your hides," Bryn countered, a sudden sharp flare of anger cutting through her exhaustion. It was a stupid thing to say. Anger was a luxury humans could not afford here. A few of the wolves growled, low vibrating sounds that raised the hairs on Bryn's arms. Torin raised a single scarred hand, and the yard fell dead silent. He studied her. He looked at her the way a butcher weighs a cheap, stringy cut of meat. "You want meat?" Torin asked softly. "You want oats?" He gestured lazily with 2 fingers. At the far end of the yard, the heavy wooden doors of the stables groaned open. A cacophony of violence erupted. It sounded like wood splintering and iron shrieking. 2 massive lichen guards, men who could tear a stag apart with their bare hands, were dragged out of the shadows. They weren't holding ropes. They were holding thick, rusted iron chains. At the center of the chains was a horse. Or something that had once been a horse. It was a massive roan stallion, its coat the color of dried blood, matted with sweat and filth. Its eyes were rolled back, showing stark, terrifying white. Foam dripped from its mouth, clinging to its jaw in thick gray strings. It reared, throwing its front hooves into the air, the heavy iron chains clanking as the guards cursed and dug their boots into the mud, fighting simply to keep it grounded. "That is ruin," Torin said, not raising his voice over the beast's frantic snorting. "He crushed a man's ribs to powder 3 days ago. He is useless to me. If you can ride him just once around this yard without dying, you can have him. Butcher him. Feed your children, and I will throw in the grain." Bryn stared at the horse. The stench of its hot, sour sweat reached her, overpowering the smell of the wolves. It was an animal completely unhinged by fear and abuse. "I am not a rider," she whispered. Her stomach churned violently. She tasted bile at the back of her throat. "Then you are not a savior," Torin replied coldly, leaning back in his chair. "Go back to the cauldrons, little weaver. Let the weak die. That is the way of the winter." She wanted to turn around. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to walk away. She was tired. Her knees were shaking so badly, she felt she might collapse into the mud. She hated the king, but more than that, she hated the raw, helpless reality of her own fragile body. A fall from that beast would snap her neck. It would be a meaningless, ugly death in a filthy yard. But then she looked at the heavy, smug faces of the pack. They were already turning away, chuckling, dismissed by her anticipated cowardice. They lived in a world of absolute power, where fear was the only currency that mattered. Something ugly and irrational twisted in Bryn's chest. It wasn't bravery, it was spite. Pure, bitter, exhausted spite. She took a step forward. The mud made a wet, sucking sound. The yard fell quiet again, save for the frantic, wet breathing of the horse. "Hold the chains," Bryn said, her voice shaking violently. She didn't look at Torin. She kept her eyes fixed on the heaving, blood-colored flank of the beast. "Just hold the chains until I have the mane." The closer she got, the larger Ruin became. The beast was a furnace, radiating intense heat into the freezing air. His chest heaved with brutal, jerky spasms. Bryn could see the raw, bleeding sores around his mouth where the bit had been violently forced, and the deep, crisscrossing scars along his shoulders. He didn't look at her like a predator. He looked at her with the panicked, blind terror of a prey animal that had been cornered by monsters. The two guards holding the chains sneered as she approached, though they were sweating from the exertion of holding the animal. "Get back, human," one grunted, his arms trembling under the tension of the iron. "He'll kick your skull inside out." "Drop the left chain," Bryn ordered. She was surprised by the flat, dead tone of her own voice. The nausea had receded, replaced by a cold, detached numbness. The guard looked to Torin. The king gave a slow, deliberate nod. The heavy iron chain fell into the mud with a dull thud. The sudden release of tension on one side caused Ruin to stagger. He snorted, throwing his heavy head toward Bryn, hot breath blasting across her face. He smelled of rotting hay and pure adrenaline. Bryn didn't reach out slowly. She didn't whisper soothing words. She knew better. This animal was deafened by its own panic. Soft words would just be another hiss in the wind. Instead, she stepped directly into his shoulder, closing the distance so abruptly that if he kicked, the blow wouldn't have room to build lethal momentum. She pressed her side against his burning, coarse coat. She reached up and grabbed a thick handful of his tangled black mane. The coarse hair dug under her fingernails. "Drop the other," she said. "You're dead, girl," the second guard muttered, letting the chain slip from his massive hands. For a fraction of a second, the horse didn't realize it was free. In that microsecond, Bryn dug the toe of her boot into the meat of his knee, ignored the screaming pain in her own joints, and hauled her body upward. It was an ugly, desperate scramble. Her stomach hit his spine, knocking the wind out of her. She threw her right leg over just as the horse registered the weight. Ruin exploded. There was no buildup, no warning. The ground simply vanished, replaced by violent, chaotic geometry. The horse didn't just buck, he contorted, twisting his massive frame in midair. Bryn was thrown forward, the pommel of the saddle slamming into her pelvic bone with a sickening crack that made her vision go entirely white for a second. She had no stirrups, she had no reins, only the fistfuls of coarse mane. When Ruin hit the ground, the impact traveled up Bryn's spine like a lightning bolt. Her teeth slammed together, biting the inside of her cheek. Warm, metallic blood flooded her mouth. The horse surged forward, tearing through the muddy yard. The crowd of wolves scattered, cursing and shouting as the massive roan barreled toward them. Bryn squeezed her thighs against the saddle until the muscles cramped and burned. She was slipping to the left. The freezing wind tore tears from her eyes, blurring the stone walls and the gray sky into streaks of violent motion. She could hear the wet, rhythmic slapping of hooves in the mud, incredibly fast, incredibly heavy. Ruin was blind with panic, running away from the ghosts of the chains, running away from the scent of the wolves. He was heading straight for the southern perimeter. The southern wall was a relic of the old fortress. It was 12 feet of sheer, jagged granite, overgrown with dead, black ivy. Torin's wolves didn't jump it. They were heavy earthbound fighters. They patrolled the gates. The wall was a physical boundary, a solid line marking the edge of the king's immediate domain. Bryn saw the wall rushing toward them. A sane rider would pull back. A sane rider would force the horse to turn, avoiding the crushing impact of a head-on collision. But Bryn couldn't steer him. And in a flash of dark, reckless clarity, she realized she didn't want to. If they hit the wall, it was over. If they tried to turn in this mud, the horse would slip, roll, and crush her. She leaned forward, burying her face in the thick, sweaty neck of the beast. She didn't pull back. She shifted her weight, driving her heels slightly backward, communicating one simple, terrifying command. Go. Ruin didn't hesitate. Driven by the madness of his fear and the sudden, bizarre alignment of the dead weight on his back, he gathered his hindquarters. The takeoff was a brutal, muscular contraction. Bryn felt the immense power of the animal uncoil beneath her. For a terrifying, silent moment, gravity ceased to exist. The wind stopped howling in her ears. She was suspended over the jagged top of the stone wall, looking down at the frozen, dead earth on the other side. They cleared the stone by an inch. One of Ruin's back hooves clipped the granite, sending a spray of sparks and a sharp crack echoing into the air. The landing was a disaster. The ground on the other side was uneven and frozen hard. Ruin hit the earth with his front legs, buckled, and slid. Bryn was thrown violently forward, tearing the skin from her palms as she lost her grip on his mane. She tumbled over his shoulder, hitting the frozen dirt. The impact drove every ounce of air from her lungs. She rolled, the frozen ridges of dirt bruising her ribs, tearing the wool of her tunic, until she finally came to a stop against the trunk of a dead oak tree. She lay there, paralyzed by the sheer absence of oxygen. The world spun in nauseating circles of gray and brown. She could hear Ruin scrambling to his feet a few yards away, snorting, his breath rattling in his chest, but he wasn't running anymore. The run had broken his panic. Slowly, agonizingly, Bryn dragged air back into her chest. It felt like inhaling shards of glass. She spat a mouthful of blood onto the frost. She forced herself up onto her elbows, her arms trembling violently. Beyond the wall, the courtyard was perfectly, entirely silent. Not a single wolf growled. Not a single guard shifted his weight. Bryn looked back at the top of the 12-foot granite barrier. Slowly, over the edge of the stone, the massive, dark silhouette of King Torin appeared. He stood at the precipice, looking down at the broken, bleeding human girl and the exhausted horse that had just done the impossible. The cynical boredom was completely gone from his face, replaced by a heavy, dangerous, and profound confusion. The silence on the far side of the wall was heavier than the winter air. Bryn lay curled against the roots of the dead oak, her breathing shallow, erratic, and loud in her own ears. Every inhalation dragged against her bruised ribs. The metallic taste of blood in her mouth had thickened into a copper sludge. A few yards away, Ruin stood with his head low, his massive, dark chest heaving, steam rolling off his sweat-soaked coat in thick white waves. He didn't look monstrous anymore. He just looked broken. Above them, Torin stood on the granite precipice. He didn't shout down at her. He didn't command his guards to fetch her. He simply stepped off the 12-foot ledge. He didn't land with supernatural grace. He dropped like a falling boulder. The heavy soles of his leather boots hit the frozen earth with a sickening, audible crunch, buckling the frost-heaved soil beneath his weight. He absorbed the impact entirely in his knees and thick thighs, straightening up slowly. The dark furs of his cloak settled around his broad shoulders. Bryn forced her hands flat against the freezing dirt. Her palms were scraped raw, bright red lines of blood welling up where the coarse mane had burned through her skin. She pushed. Her left arm gave out immediately, sending her crashing back down into the dead leaves. Torin closed the distance in 5 long strides. He stopped just short of where she lay. He smelled sharply of cold iron, wet fur, and the bitter tang of crushed pine needles. "You ruined a perfectly good execution, human," he said. His voice was a low, resonant gravel that vibrated in the tight space between them. Bryn turned her head, spitting a dark clot of blood onto the frost. "You told me to ride him," she rasped, her voice catching on the dryness in her throat. "I rode him. You jumped a siege wall blindly," Torin corrected, tilting his head. His pale eyes scanned her broken posture, calculating the damage. A wall built to stop battering rams. If he had clipped his front hooves, his neck would have snapped, and he would have crushed you into paste. Then you wouldn't have to give up your oats. Bryn managed to get her right elbow under her ribs, levering herself up to a sitting position. The world tilted violently to the left, then slowly righted itself. Her pelvis screamed in agony where the saddle horn had slammed into her. Torin crouched. The sudden proximity of him was suffocating. He was too large, a creature built for tearing meat from bone, occupying too much space in the quiet, frozen woods. He reached out with one massive, scarred hand and grabbed the heavy wool of her tunic near her collarbone. He didn't pull her, but the threat of it was there, a casual display of absolute physical dominance. "I don't care about the oats," Torin said softly, his gaze locking onto hers. There was a terrifying stillness to him now, completely stripped of the bored, cynical king he had played in the courtyard. "I care about why a weaver's tithe, who shakes when she stands in the mud, just threw her life away out of sheer spite." "I didn't throw it away," Bryn whispered. She didn't pull back from his grip, mostly because she lacked the strength to move. "I survived. The children get to eat." Torin searched her face. He was looking for fear, for the trembling submission he was accustomed to. She was terrified. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird in her chest, but she was too exhausted to hide it, and too angry to let it control her. He released her tunic abruptly and stood. He turned his back on her, walking toward the exhausted stallion. Ruin flinched as the king approached, but the horse was too tired to run. Torin grabbed the frayed leather halter. "Open the southern gates!" Torin's voice boomed, carrying easily over the high stone wall. A heavy, grinding sound echoed from the other side. Within moments, the massive iron-reinforced timber doors at the far end of the fortress began to swing outward, pushed by groaning guards. Torin looked back at Bryn. "Get up!" "I need a minute," she ground out, holding her side. "You do not get a minute," he replied flatly. "You struck a bargain with a king in front of his pack. If you want them to respect the terms, you will walk back through those gates leading the prize you won. You will not crawl." It was a cruel demand. It was also the absolute truth. If they saw her broken, the wolves would find a way to take the grain back before nightfall. Bryn closed her eyes. She pictured the empty, hollowed-out faces of the children in the weaving sheds. She pictured the locked silos. Digging her raw fingers into the frozen dirt, she dragged her legs beneath her. The pain in her hip was blinding, a sharp, stabbing white heat. She swayed, gripping the rough bark of the dead oak to steady herself. She limped forward. Every step was a calculated negotiation with agony. When she reached Torin, he wordlessly handed her the fraying leather lead of the halter. She didn't look at him. She wrapped the leather around her bleeding palm and tugged gently. Ruin exhaled a long, shuddering breath, lowered his heavy head, and followed her. They walked through the open southern gates together, a limping, battered girl in torn wool and a blood-roan beast covered in sweat and mud. The courtyard was completely silent. The wolves, hundreds of them, lined the pathways. They didn't bow. They didn't cheer, they just stared, their golden and amber eyes tracking her every painful step. It wasn't reverence. It was the eerie, unnatural quiet of predators watching a prey animal do something they could not comprehend. Garth! Torin's voice echoed behind her, cutting through the silence. The quartermaster, a hulking brute with a missing ear, stepped forward from the crowd. He looked uneasy. "Load the sledges," Torin commanded, walking past Bryn without looking at her. 6 sacks of oats, 4 salted hogs. Deliver them to the human sheds before the sun sets. And if I hear that a single grain went missing. He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. He walked up the stone steps to the great hall, leaving Bryn alone in the mud with a psychotic horse and the heavy, terrifying weight of what she had just done. The weavers' quarters were located in the lowest level of the northern keep, a damp, cavernous cellar constructed of weeping stone and rotting support beams. It smelled permanently of wet sheep's wool, stale sweat, and the sharp, acrid stench of lye used for washing. Today, it also smelled of roasted meat. When the lichen guards had dragged the sledges down the ramp, tossing the heavy, frozen carcasses of the salted hogs onto the stone floor, chaos had erupted. The humans hadn't cheered. They had scrambled, a desperate, frantic mob driven by the primal ache in their bellies. Marta, the oldest woman in the sheds, had taken control, beating back eager hands with a wooden stirring spoon until order was restored and the fires were stoked. Bryn sat in the farthest corner, shrouded in shadows, her back pressed against the freezing, damp stone wall. She had a chipped clay mug of hot oat broth in her hands, but she hadn't taken a sip. She was shivering violently. The adrenaline crash was brutal. Stripped of the panic and the spite, her body was finally processing the trauma of the ride and the fall. Beneath her ragged tunic, her ribs were blossoming into an ugly canvas of purple and black. Her hip throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm that made her nauseous. "Drink," Marta ordered, appearing out of the gloom. Her gray hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat from the cooking fires. She pushed a heavy iron spoon into Bryn's mug before it congeals. Before it congeals. "I can't stomach it," Bryn whispered, her teeth clattering against the rim of the cup. "You will drink it," Marta said grimly, crouching beside her. She lowered her voice, her eyes darting nervously toward the ramp that led up to the wolf domain. "They are talking about you, Bryn. The guards, who dropped the meat. They said you bewitched the beast. They said you looked the alpha in the eye and didn't blink." "I was trying not to die, Marta," Bryn replied flatly, staring into the murky broth. "There was no witchcraft. Just a 12-foot wall and a frightened animal. It doesn't matter what it was. It matters what they think it was." Marta grabbed Bryn's freezing hand. "You challenged his authority in the yard. You forced his hand. I got us food. You made yourself visible," Marta hissed, squeezing her hand painfully tight. "Tithes who make themselves visible do not live long in this keep." A sudden, sharp change in the air pressure silenced whatever Bryn was going to say. The low hum of conversation around the cooking fires died instantly. The clatter of wooden bowls ceased. The cellar plunged into a profound, terrified silence. Bryn looked toward the ramp. The shadows shifted. King Torin stood at the base of the stone incline. He had shed his heavy winter cloak, wearing only a thick, dark, leather tunic laced at the chest, exposing the scarred, pale skin of his throat. He ducked slightly to avoid the low support beams, his immense frame making the large cellar suddenly feel claustrophobic. The ambient heat in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by the heavy, predatory chill he carried with him. The humans flattened themselves against the walls, lowering their heads, averting their eyes. Torin ignored them entirely. His pale eyes scanned the gloom, locking onto the far corner. He walked slowly, his heavy boots making no sound on the damp flagstones. He stopped a few feet from Bryn. He looked down at her, noting the untouched broth, the violent shivering, and the unnatural angle at which she favored her left leg. "Leave us," Torrin said. It was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. Marta scrambled backward, abandoning Bryn instantly, dissolving into the shadows with the rest of the humans. Torrin didn't ask for permission. He stepped forward, invading her small corner, and crouched directly in front of her. The scent of pine and cold iron washed over her, overpowering the smell of the wet wool. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, heavy clay jar. "Arnica and crushed bone marrow," Torrin said, holding the jar out. "For the bruising. Apply it to your ribs and your hip." Bryn stared at the jar. She didn't reach for it. "Is this a reward or an apology?" she asked, her voice raspy, trembling despite her efforts to control it. "It is maintenance," Torrin replied coldly. "You claim the horse. Ruin requires tending, and you are currently too broken to lift a bucket of water, let alone groom a warhorse." "He's not a warhorse. He's a victim of your guards." Torrin's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the heavy stubble on his cheek. For a second, Bryn thought he might strike her. Instead, he placed the jar roughly on the stone floor beside her boot. "My guards are butchers," Torrin agreed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. "They understand force. They do not understand leverage. You understand leverage. You knew if you failed, you died. If you succeeded, you forced me to honor a treaty I had already discarded. You weaponized your own fragility." "I was trying to feed starving children," Bryn snapped back, the anger cutting through her shivering. She finally looked up, meeting his pale, heavy-lidded eyes. "I didn't map out a political strategy in the mud. I just refused to watch them eat tree bark, while you sat in a chair and watched us die." Torrin leaned in closer. The heat radiating off his chest was palpable, a stark contrast to the freezing, damp walls of the cellar. He studied the raw, angry scabs on her palms, the dark bruising already blooming along her jawline, where her teeth had slammed together. "You are imperfect," Torrin murmured, almost to himself. It wasn't an insult, it was an observation, heavy with a strange, dark curiosity. "You are breakable, yet you leaped." "And you honored the deal?" Bryn countered, refusing to look away, despite every instinct telling her to lower her gaze. "Why?" "Because a pack is held together by absolute rules, little weaver," Torrin said, his eyes dropping to her bruised mouth for a fraction of a second, before returning to her eyes. "If I break my word in the yard, I lose the teeth of my reign. You trapped me." He stood up smoothly, unfolding his massive frame in the cramped space. He looked down at her one last time, his expression unreadable, a violent storm hidden behind a mask of cold stone. "Use the salve," he ordered softly. "Ruin will need to be fed at dawn, and he will only let you near him." He turned and walked back toward the ramp, leaving the cellar in breathless silence. Leaving Bryn alone with a small clay jar and a terrifying realization that she had not just survived the king's challenge, she had caught his attention. Dawn in the northern stronghold did not arrive with golden light. It bled into the sky like a pale, freezing bruise. Bryn woke to the agonizing realization that her body had seized into a solid block of pain overnight. The arnica salve Torrin had left smelled of sharp mint and crushed earth. It had taken the edge off the burning in her hip, but every time she drew a deep breath, her ribs protested with a sharp, stabbing ache. She lay on the damp wool blanket for a long time, staring up at the rotting timber of the cellar ceiling. The other humans were still asleep, huddled together in shivering mounds. Bryn rolled onto her good side, biting back a groan that tasted of copper. She forced herself up. The stone floor was agonizingly cold against her bare feet as she shoved them into her stiff, cracked boots. She wrapped her torn tunic tightly around her torso, the dried mud flaking off the fabric, and began the long climb up the ramp. The air in the courtyard was sharp enough to slice lung tissue. The mud of the yard had frozen solid overnight, forming jagged, treacherous ridges. Bryn limped across the expanse, her breath pluming in thick white clouds before her. The guards on the wall watched her, their amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They didn't sneer this time. They just stared. The stables were vast, heavily timbered structures that reeked of ammonia, wet leather, and old oats. When Bryn pulled the heavy iron latch, the door shrieked on its hinges. She found Ruin in the very last stall, isolated behind thick iron bars, usually reserved for breeding alphas in their rut. The stallion was pacing. The heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of his hooves against the packed dirt floor echoed in the quiet barn. When he saw her, he stopped instantly. His ears pinned flat against his skull, and he let out a low, warning snort. His coat was a mess of dried sweat and mud, hiding the dark roan color beneath. Bryn stopped. Her hands were shaking. In the pale morning light, stripped of the adrenaline of the yard, the sheer size of the animal was terrifying. He could crush her skull with a single strike of a hoof. She turned away from the bars and walked to the grain bins. Lifting the wooden scoop required both hands and sent a jolt of fire through her bruised side. She filled a heavy bucket with oats, then dragged it to the water trough to mix it into a thick, heavy mash. It took her 10 agonizing minutes just to drag the bucket back to the iron-barred stall. She didn't speak to the horse. She didn't offer a soothing, musical whisper. She unlocked the heavy iron bolt with numb, clumsy fingers and pushed the door open just enough to slide her body through. Ruin threw his head up, his eyes rolling back to show white. He backed into the corner, his hindquarters bumping against the heavy timber wall with a dull thud. Bryn kicked the bucket forward. The wood scraped harshly against the dirt. She kept her eyes on his chest, not his eyes watching for the sudden tensing of muscle that would precede a strike. She pushed the bucket into the center of the stall, then took 3 deliberate steps backward, pressing her own back against the iron bars. They stood there in the freezing gloom. The horse was trembling. Bryn was trembling. It wasn't a profound, magical bond. It was a standoff between 2 broken things that expected to be hit. "He thinks you're going to chain him again." The voice came from the corridor. Bryn flinched, her shoulder jarring against the iron bars. King Torin stepped out of the shadows. He was dressed for the cold in a heavy wolf pelt cloak, but he moved silently, completely at ease in the freezing environment. He leaned his broad shoulder against the wooden pillar opposite Ruin's stall, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked impossibly large in the cramped space of the stable. "I'm not going to chain him," Bryn rasped, her voice thick from sleep and the cold. "He doesn't know that," Torin replied, his gaze drifting from the horse to Bryn's bruised face. "Animals, driven to madness by pain, don't understand good intentions, little Weaver. They only understand leverage and space. You took his space in the yard yesterday. You forced him to move. I was trying not to be crushed. And yet, you directed his terror. You gave him a wall, and you made him jump it." Torin tilted his head, his pale eyes catching the weak dawn light. "Why aren't you looking at him?" "Because if I make eye contact, he'll take it as a challenge. He's cornered." A low, vibrating sound rumbled in Torin's chest. It took Bryn a second to realize it was a hum of approval. Inside the stall, the smell of the damp oats finally overpowered the horse's panic. Ruin took a hesitant, jerky step forward. His muzzle dropped to the bucket. He snorted violently, blowing chaff into the air, before taking a hurried, aggressive bite of the mash. He chewed frantically, his eyes still locked on Bryn, waiting for the trap to spring. "You didn't run when he charged," Torin murmured, his voice dropping an octave, blending with the sound of the horse chewing. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the pillar, walking slowly toward the stall door. "You didn't beg yesterday when you asked for the grain. You bleed, you shake, you shatter, but you don't submit." Torin stopped right outside the bars, mere inches from where Bryn stood on the inside. The heat radiating from his massive frame seeped through the iron, contrasting sharply with the freezing air. He reached a scarred hand through the bars, not toward the horse, but toward her. Bryn's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. His rough knuckles brushed against the unbruised skin of her cheekbone. It wasn't a gentle touch, it was an assessment, heavy and possessive. The smell of pine and cold, dark intent flooded her senses. "You changed the rules of my yard, Bryn," Torin said softly, saying her name for the first time. The sound of it in his mouth felt dangerous, and the pack knows it. They will test you now. They will see if the human who flew over the siege wall can survive the ground. "Are you going to let them?" she asked, her voice a fragile, thin wire, holding back a surge of panic. Torin's thumb grazed her jawline, a slow, deliberate pressure. "I am going to watch," he corrected, his pale eyes darkening. "If you fall, you are meat. But if you stand, I might just give you a kingdom." He withdrew his hand, stepping back into the shadows of the corridor. Bryn stood frozen against the iron bars, the horse chewing loudly in the corner, realizing with a cold, absolute certainty that the jump over the wall was the easy part. The real survival had just begun. Bryn survived the jump, but did she just land in a much deadlier trap? King Torin is no longer just watching a tithe. He's studying an equal, and the pack is waiting for her to show weakness. The tension between them is a powder keg ready to blow. If you want to see how Bryn navigates the vicious politics of the Lycan court and what Torin does next, smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe. You won't want to miss the next upload.